Is it possible to defeat Hamas militarily while staying within the boundaries of international law? TL Doctor, is it really possible to fight an enemy that's heavily embedded within civilian populations and stay within the boundaries of international law? Full question. Many believe that Hamas hides command centers and weapon installations within civilian buildings, such as hospitals. While this is disputed by some, it's a matter of public record that Hamas have encouraged civilians to put themselves in harm's way by asking the population of northern Gaza to remain in their homes despite the then impending invasion. As the war has gone on, international bodies such as the UN and other legal experts who specialize in conflict have stated that Israel's attacks on these buildings breach international law. Specifically, they argue that many of the attacks do not meet requirement for proportionality, that the potential military gain must be weighed against the potential for civilian casualties. However, the Israeli response is that it would effectively have been impossible for them to avoid these civilian casualties given that Hamas is so embedded within the local population. And of course the argument is that Israel must remove Hamas in order to ensure its own security. Working backwards from the Israeli point of view, if we start from an assumption that Hamas does need to be removed from power, I know many people will disagree with this. But this question is specifically about the Israeli military's conduct in war. Is it even possible to do so while not breaching international law? And more broadly, what does the conclusion from this mean for other conflicts taken to the extreme? Can an enemy combatant make themselves effectively undefeatable by embedding themselves with civilians? I expect the response will be that there is a threshold at which point this is untenable. But then you enter the realm of subjectivity. The Israelis clearly feel their security is under grave threat. How can one legally argue that this isn't the case? And who is the arbiter for whether or not their security is or isn't under serious threat? To be clear, this isn't intended to be a discussion of whether Israel's actions are morally right or wrong, or get into a big debate about the history of the region, although I imagine the latter will be difficult to avoid. This is specifically about the legality of attacks on civilian buildings. I think that Pakistan had a similar situation with the Taliban. The Taliban had destroyed a school, killed children. That was very upsetting. Enough so that the army encircled the province and said figuratively, everyone leaving gives us their fingerprints, gets a government id issued. If you are already wanted, there will be consequences. Everyone left inside after 2 weeks or something like this. The point is that there was plenty enough time to move. Shall be considered a terrorist. People have moved out. The army did their thing. The people moved back in. It is possible. Good luck proving that Israel's response wasn't proportional in the aftermath of this war. It won't happen. The reality is that it is going to be very difficult to prove that Israel committed war crimes here. They are operating in the gray zone. Anyone who denies this isn't being honest with themselves, referring to hardliners that think Israel's response clearly is a war crime or clearly is not a war crime. What legal precedent are these UN experts going to draw upon to prove Israel's response was not proportional? First off, who is the almighty arbiter that gets to decide what is or isn't proportional? What does it mean to defeat Hamas militarily? Killing members of the group will create more militants. It seems impossible that way. The population of Gaza could be forced to leave as refugees, but not without breaking international law. Probably there is no way to defeat Hamas militarily. The only realistic option is to cease the expansion of Israel and negotiate in a meaningful way. It's been done in other places and has worked. Ultimately, I doubt there is any political will to do so. when it appears possible to force the population to leave as refugees. I don't think it is possible to militarily defeat Hamas without violating international humanitarian. It is important to note that it is not a viable excuse to commit war crimes, that doing so was necessary to achieve your strategic military goals. If you cannot achieve your strategic goals without committing war crimes, you need to reconsider your strategy. It's possible to have far less civilian casualties by combing out Gaza with infantry instead of bombing it indiscriminately, so they can hold fire if turns out the person in front of their gun is a child. It will be more costly in terms of lives of IDF troops because they place themselves in a position where enemy combatants can actually hit them. Countries will only follow laws if they think they will win their war, because most would logically prioritize their country's existence over following an externally imposed law. That being said, the Israel situation is unique because they are the clearly superior force and believe they may lose their country, which is why the killing is so lopsided. Hamas isn't a problem that should be solved militarily to begin with. Military interventions of this kind inevitably just lend credibility to the groups they're meant to combat, e.g. Hamas, Taliban, ISIS, etc., keeping them relevant for longer. You cannot defeat Hamas militarily. If every last Hamas member gets wiped out and I am a 17-year-old traumatized Palestinian kid whose whole family got buried under rubble and blown up in the process of defeating Hamas, the first thing I would do is founding Hamas too. It's not possible because there is a massive difference between a nation at war and terrorist tactics. And Hamas, an internationally recognized terrorist organization, exploits the fact that they are not a national government who are expected to adhere to international law to do things such as choose an urban center as a battleground, not wear uniforms, making it impossible to differentiate combatants from non-combatants, and operating from within protected areas. Fighting against a terrorist group is a million times harder than fighting against a national military. Hamas is a non-state actor. The laws of warfare apply only to state versus state conflicts. The IDF is applying the accepted norms of conduct against non-state entities, like ISIS, the Syrian Free Army, Taliban when out of power, Ref. Cred brigades, ERA, etc. But the IDF is losing the propaganda war. I thought it was better than that. That's a big issue because there's no such thing as international law. There are a hodgepodge of treaties that some countries have signed and others have not. But since there's no international Congress or international president or international police that have jurisdiction over every country on earth, people like to say war crimes and international law, but really you're only subject to the victor if you lose, and to any treaties your country is party to. Probably not, but they could stay a hell lot more within those bounds than they currently are. There is no war without unnecessary cruelty and atrocities. Some anthropologists even include this in their definition of war. But it is quite clear that Israel is not caring about civilian casualties at all, even in proportion to their previous military operations in Gaza. Counter-question: is it possible to defeat a guerrilla group embedded within the civilian population, with wide popular support in a conventional war? Period. You could destroy Hamas, legally or not, and another group would appear because there are actors that want the conflict to endure and not be resolved and are pouring resources to fuel the conflict. Easy peasy. Just escort journalists out of the area before they got hit by stray bullet.